Kwe, Tanze, good morning, bonjour. My name's Pam Demoff. I'm the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this event to sign a protocol agreement with the Assembly of First Nations on the Child and Family Services reform. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Ottawa, the unceded tradition. We're honored to welcome Elder Mike Mitchell, who will officially open our meeting by blessing us with a prayer.
Ehni gwede gando agada lorg. Kahnumwe. Ande wa hiala ne, da si doan horado, ne se kwaya dis. Ne da sungwayo. Ne hoda ne, ein gweda ni lat stak. Di chinoro, ye chinista haji hunjad. Tani no agwego, ne, da gwetskau hake, ne hoda no ne, ein gweda niru. Tuno ehni gahne galunyo. Ehni yuhunjade. Ehni uniga hrahere. Kayo ehtona down hake. Tono duats kahto. Kayo tona down hakes. Uji dogon la diges. Toni noe aduatage. Kaili niga walake. Haze chiagwego. Neda hodio dake. Eduatage. Tano ne enige negwa duats kahto. Ne degin de garakware. Aska ne yeti sot at sotaneka garakwa. Tanaska ne noa when is arade do swatet. Negadina ne agwego agagweni. And the wait no ne guaniguna. Did what the no agwego tin you waiti not. Dano ne oni. Who just an equation to what's cartus. Asotaneka no go. Ne tisa to go. De nyandeste. Tenija to 100 down hike. Ona aleoga, asotsaneka na gwa. Onene oni, hisina garu hiati, ne, tono sagori humde. Ne gairi yungwedake, ne dinkianya dunge, cheni yo chinko danhage chi humjat. Tano ne oni sayata, esori odan. Ne aidoyena, ne ngwawana, tano ne chenichi, tidwa denu horatus. Ne skanya dario, na hosanodo. Ne sahari hokta hagwego na yada sa yung wato se ji gwe honwe. Ne gadi sa we gadina ne tani ton hike. Ona ne gutsko. Igwa wishlon hike. Avse do wayena na go wana. Ona isina garu hiadi ne tada naktala gwani ne se gwa yadis. Ne gadina ne do yara. Ne jina hoda ne yugwaya. Jini gariwis igwa naktete humjaga dingwa don hike. Gutsko ne dachido anu hora dunseke. Dejena hoda na ne yungwaya mjake. Ne ngwa hwachere jidwaya datsu. Agugani tisa togunha. Da hadigun sadugini ni hitodi yumsa. Agwego jidwa rodake. Di chinora agwego ne skone dono dunyo. De yatiyo danse ngwa sunwa. Dano ne ode de gan kanu swanake do adayat. Ne da hodio dake unaya ne rodigyo. Ne gadina ne no honizarate. Achidori wane ganse ne sequoia dis. Ain guayanda ke ne skadi gunlio. Dano ne yona na amsto noa. Ajegaji yuri hoana na dum down wadiri watati. Azewe gadine waganu dungo no honizarate. Dan on di do dansa, na don dan do de watega de tanayo te zwani guna. Dan eto.
Thank you for that beautiful prayer, Elder Mitchell. National Chief Bellegarde was saying earlier how important ceremony is, and we did have a gift of tobacco prior to coming into the room. It's now my honor to welcome National Chief Perry Bellegarde of the Assembly of First Nations to today's event.
Hei, naskum nista naskum tin wa kakio. Kite Mike naskum tin. No tauinan smantu naskum tin. Jenish na bek algonquins naskum tin wa nista taplemiasik. My friends and relatives, just to acknowledge the Creator for another beautiful day and thanking Mike for the prayer and acknowledging that we're on unceded Algonquin territory, thanking them. the Minister Mark for being here, and as well the Deputy Parliamentary Secretary Pam. It's a good day because we're talking about the implementation of Bill C-92. And I've always said it's one thing to get things passed into law, but it's really more important about the implementation of that law. And we've always talked about a distinctions-based approach for implementation of Bill C-92. And that's really what this MOU is about. And it's about improving the quality of life for our children. We know there's 40,000 children in foster care right across Canada. And when Bill C-92 was passed, it was about making a difference and making sure that those children were looked after, that they were able to be kept home in their families and communities surrounded by their relatives. And that's really what this is about, making a difference for the children that are in care. And in C-92, I've always said it before, that one of the most important things in C-92 is that First Nations come out. And I've always said this to our chiefs and councils and membership across Canada, that you need to occupy the field, create your own laws and exert your own jurisdiction. And this is what C-92 is about. And that's the opportunity. It's the first time other governments have recognized, because our leadership and our laws and sovereignty are always forgotten, put to the side. But in this piece of legislation, it was recognized. So now it's time for implementation. And that's really what this MOU is about, is implementation of Bill C-92. And of course, along with that is the necessary resources that will have to be forthcoming, and it's needs-based. And that's an important thing to remember. It's needs-based, and to get those resources out to make that difference. And that's my comments this morning, really, what it's about. And I want to call on, as National Chief, we've got 10 regional chiefs across Canada, and we get to hand out portfolios. And one of the portfolios, of course, is child welfare. This is a very important issue. And one of our regional chiefs as a team, Regional Chief Kevin Hart from Manitoba, has worked hard along with a team of chiefs and delegates and officials to make this happen. So I also want to have him say a few words regarding C-92 and this MOU we're signing. Chief Kevin Hart, I believe, is on the line.
Morning, National Chief.
Oh, there he is. Danse.
Dante, National Chief.
Mananto, kima, go ahead. Pipik straight up, Sisi. Go ahead.
Oh, I want to welcome everybody and thank Elder Mike Mitchell for the opening prayer, as well as to acknowledge the Algonquin territory. I want to bring greetings to everybody from the Treaty 1 territory here in Manitoba. And as the national portfolio holder for child welfare from the social development sector, today we're celebrating the signature of a historical agreement that will undoubtedly advance the rights of our children and our families. I want to acknowledge our Chiefs Committee on Child Welfare because this protocol between the Assembly of First Nations and Canada is a pathway that supports First Nations in exercising their jurisdiction over the well-being of their children and families. And it's very important for us as First Nations that this is the first time that Canada recognizes our sovereignty and jurisdiction when it comes to creating our own laws, especially when it comes to the well-being, again, of our children and our families. I can assure you that this agreement does not represent a one-size-fits-all approach. The protocol will support First Nations as they transition towards exercising jurisdiction over child and family services in a process and at a pace that they determine. And that's very important when First Nations are starting to go back to creating their own laws according to the ways and the protocols and the tradition of our people. There has to be an understanding that our needs as First Nations are very unique. The protocol is a positive step, not only to ensure that the needs of our families are being heard at the national level, but also to strengthen the working relationship between Canada and First Nations. And that's more evident, even more so right now across the nation as you see what's transpiring, and that for us to sign this protocol agreement today is very historic. Engaging in legislation, as you know, is a complex endeavor because of the differences between First Nations on Turtle Island. A First Nations determined distinctions-based plan that is flexible to account for all the many different legal political and cultural variances is a phenomenal achievement. Now we must put it into action. I look forward to the work ahead, working with leadership and everybody, especially to protect our children and families. You know, it's our duty as First Nation leaders to create a better future for our children and families. And I figure this is the utmost importance, even more so right now with what we're seeing transpiring nationally. All Canadians as treaty people share responsibility in creating and keeping respectful relationships for the benefit of our children. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, National Chief Bellegarde and Regional Chief Hart, for your words and most especially for your leadership on this issue. I'd now like to ask you to join me in welcoming the Honourable Mark Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services of Canada.
Thank you, Pam. Kwe Tanse, good morning. My speech said good afternoon, so maybe they wanted me to say it this afternoon, but we're early. Good morning. Bonjour. What kono do ize, Mike? Nyongo eneti gawanios. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Canada's Parliament is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin people. Today, thanks to the help of technology and some adequate physical distancing, we can gather for this historic occasion. I want to thank National Chief Bellegarde, Regional Chief Hart, who you just heard, and all those who have contributed to the productive partnership that has made this day possible. The Child and Family Services Protocol between the Assembly of First Nations and Canada is an expression of mutual cooperation. It's the realization of a new structure, collaborative work on the implementation of an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis children, youth, and families. I'm proud to be able to participate in such an event today on a topic of the utmost importance, keeping First Nations children and families together, connected to their families, cultures, and communities. The coming into force of the Act on January 1st of this year marked a historic turning point for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children and families. It finally put into place what Indigenous peoples across this country have been asking for governments for decades, that their inherent jurisdiction over child and family services over their children be affirmed. This legislation provides flexible pathways for Indigenous peoples to move forward with their own models and laws so that they can decide what is best for their children, their families, and their communities. It respects the role of communities, cultures, and languages in the role it plays for nurturing children. The Act also puts forward national guiding principles, creating minimum standards for all those who provide child and family services to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis families, including provinces, territories, and service providers. Ce protocole relatif aux services à l'enfance.
This protocol for the First Nations, Inuit and Métis children's youth and families is an expression of mutual cooperation. It is the realization of a new structure that will allow us to pursue and strengthen our collaborative work that we implemented for this bill, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis children, youth, and families. I'm very proud to be able to take part in such an important step today, that is maintaining families together, keeping children and youth in contact with their families, cultures, and communities. This law came into force on January 1st of this year, and this was a historic turning point for the children and families of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. For decades, they have been asking for child welfare, their inherent competence in child welfare be recognized. This legislation offers First Nations the flexibility to put in place the laws and the systems that they need in place. It respects the role of culture and community and families in raising their children and their youth. It also sets out the national standards and minimum standards for all those providing services to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children and youth and families, and that includes at the provincial level.
Presents a commitment to regular bilateral meetings and a mutually agreed schedule and agenda. It also supports the development of distinctions-based policies at the national level through the establishment of the Joint National Working Group on Legislative Implementation in relation to First Nations. The protocol allows for the development and creation of tools and mechanisms at the federal level to support implementation of the Act and the establishment of a joint fiscal table on First Nations Child and Family Services reform to explore and identify fiscal issues relevant to First Nations implementation of the legislation. The protocol will help guide discussions surrounding the implementation of the Act and ensure that this continues in the spirit of co-development. It recognizes that individual First Nations governments have the autonomy to enter into arrangements or agreements and take the other implementation steps according to their own priorities. It provides a frame from which further concrete action can be taken in the spirit of full collaboration and partnership. Ce protocole contribuera à diriger.
This protocol will contribute to direct discussions regarding the implementation of the Act, and that we continue with the spirit of co-development. It recognizes that each government of the First Nations and have the ability to set out their guiding principles and their laws based on their needs and their priorities, and it furthers the spirit of co-development and cooperation.
We will do better for Indigenous children of this country. It's a vow to Indigenous families and communities that we are determined to make things right. It is a pledge to Indigenous governments and organizations that we are dedicated to positive change. Our collective hope is that this Act will secure a better and brighter future for every subsequent generation of First Nation Inuit and Métis children in this country. The signing today signifies another good step in realizing that shared goal. Notre espoir collectif.
Our collective hope is that this law will provide more promise and opportunities to all Indigenous children. This signing ceremony is an important step in putting in place this common objective.
Together in the spirit of progress, of autonomy, of putting things right. This day is long overdue, and I'm honored to be a part of it. Miigwech, Marcy, thank you, merci.
Thank you, Minister Miller, for your heartfelt words. I'd like to now invite National Chief Bellegarde and Minister Miller to sign the Protocol Agreement on Child and Family Services Reform.
You can sign that one.
Give a pen.
Yeah. Can you use mine? You gotta sterilize it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Do you want me to hand this to hand sanitizer?
We'll do the hand sanitizer.
Yeah, we'll do the hand sanitizer later. Okay. Okay.
So thank you both. All joking aside, this is an historic moment, and I'm really honored to have been a small part of it. I'm going to turn it over now to Elder Mike Mitchell to offer us a closing prayer.
Tunyerin ya heda wahawe no ni salade. Na dego no hodi yuri wa. Ne gadi no wa ni salade. Ne do tara. Ne jido ya na jono do wasa. Ne saga. Te jido den harato. Na di do da sa ye tini sa ha jo hon jad. Na gwego jena hoda na ne don kawa hage. Na din gwada na dat sta. Negadi agwego skadi gona yonya de jeche no harato. Signore, ne chikane galunya, chiogwiroto. Kairi ni gawala ke, uchi do hogumani la digi stinkini guna moya. Yano ne oni. Digin de garakware. Aska nasu toneka na gwani tina don kwa iti sutta. Dano ne che do wachia. Ne duon oni salade do swatet. Dano ne oni. Jeśli garuhiadi, ne swadi so to naktara gwani. Negadi so wehte to yari na heda wahawe no oni salate. Tije chinu harado, agwe go chini hadu hom dawa te dano. Yechli wane ga sa gaidi ni gweda ke. Gadi yari ha ge hro no na ya skana ya se do, chenu ti so da squarun. So wehte gadi one na ga gweni. Na di gwali wa no oni salate. Ne datska no to. Tonight age ne so wani guna. Today, we have marked an important occasion, event, and before anything else, we're taught by our elders to always remember to open and close with an acknowledgement, starting from Mother Earth and everything else that gives us life. From all the land and the waters, the medicines, tree life, animal life, the four winds, the two suns, Grandmother Moon and Elder Brother Sun, the stars, and they say beyond the heavens, to the Creator Himself, we give thanks. We give thanks that we're able to walk this land in good health. We give thanks for our families. We give thanks for our communities and nations that we belong to. And we give thanks for all mankind as we walk the good road, try to understand our place on earth and beyond into the heavens, what we call our place. To secure our place, we always give ceremonial thanks, ceremonial acknowledgement to each other of respect and kindness. And those are the words that officially closes today's meeting. Each and every one of you have a safe journey back to your lodges. Tony Gamonak, Doneto.
Thank you, Elder Mike, for the beautiful prayer and ensuring that we both began and ended this event in a good way. I want to pass it over to the minister's staff, who will moderate the media availability portion of the event. But thank you again to Elder Mike Mitchell, National Chief Bellegarde, Minister Miller, and all our guests who joined us for this event today. Miigwech, merci, thank you, merci.
Merci, thank you. We will now take questions from the phone. It will be one question and one follow-up. And then after, we'll go for questions in the room. And nous allons prendre les questions premièrement au téléphone.
We'll start on the phones. One question, one follow-up, and then we will come to questions in the room. So once again, one question, one follow-up. Operator, we're ready.
Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. There will be a brief pause while the participants register for questions. Il y aura un court délai vous permettant de vous enregistrer dans la file d'attente pour la période de questions. Thank you for your patience. Merci de patienter. La première question, the first question is from Marie Vastel, Le Devoir. Please go ahead, your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Miller. Ma question est...
Good morning, Mr. Miller. My question is for you. I wanted to know if you could give us an update on the implementation of this agreement and the law in Quebec, the Quebec law in the Quebec government, rather, in December 2019 challenged your legislation. Could you tell us whether this has moved forward, this challenge has moved forward during the pandemic, and how confident are you that this protocol agreement will apply in Quebec?
Merci Marie pour la question.
Thank you, Marie, for this question. We are quite confident on the constitutional basis for this legislation, and it was implemented, or it came into force on January 1st of this year, and I don't think anybody could really deny the very minimum standards for the welfare of children that will be applied at a national basis. I know that Quebec has procedural objections, but we are very confident of the constitutional basis. There's much work that continues to be done through all provinces and territories, as I said during my speech, and we will have to reorient how we deal with young people. We wanted to be more of a support to them, and we take for granted being able to manage the education and our own children. I don't think anybody can object to that. The bill is moving forward. This is a long-term project. Those who have the inherent rights, who are the inherent right holders, as we see through enshrined in this protocol agreement, is the communities and families. This work will be done community to community with the Assembly of First Nations in the case of First Nations. This is a commitment that must be made with communities. We have to pour in the resources. that we need.
We're quite confident about the constitutional basis on which the law resides and is rested. This is about the inherent right of Indigenous peoples to have something that we take as non-Indigenous people for granted, which is the control over the edge of your own children. This is a right that has been denied to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis throughout a very painful history. And this process was something that was asked to us by Indigenous communities, and this is the reason why it was co-developed with Indigenous communities and came to fruition and in force as of the 1st of January, establishing, among other things, a bare minimum for the rights and standards to be applied to children that are in care. This isn't something I don't think anyone in this country would deny, but it has been the case in the past. There are constitutional challenge. I don't dictate the terms on which provinces take the federal government to court on constitutional basis. This is their right, but we will defend it vigorously. Who are affirming their inherent right will, I assume, do so as well. There is lots of work to do. The right holders, and I think the national chief, without taking words out of his mouth, would stress that the rights holders are communities, family members, who can avail themselves of this law, but we actually don't want to get there. We want to actually have resources in the community, decision making being made in the community, not over intervention, which has been the model and apprehension, but actually accompaniment and allowing children to return home and never get to that position. And so that's a long-term and probably a very painful process that we have to undertake over the next few years. This protocol today establishes a roadmap that far too often in the past has been without consulting or without talking about financial resources in a structured way. And this provides a roadmap and a structured way to have those discussions. And I think the beneficiaries in the long term will be Indigenous children. And that's the objective that we.
En suivi, Marie?
Oui, maybe
A follow-up, Marie?
Chief Bellegarde or Chief Hart. I don't know if he's still on the line. I'd like to know from you both whether you're concerned or worried agreement today will actually be implemented and put into place in Quebec. I don't know if Chief Hart has a good understanding from the communities on the ground, but I'd like to hear from the both of you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And from my perspective, I would encourage Premier Legault to instead of wasting resources on challenging the constitutionality of Bill C-92, is to start working with the leadership in Quebec to talk about jurisdiction and how this can be implemented fully, because it's clear that First Nations laws are paramount in the legislation. And it's not only the government of the federal government and provincial governments in Canada, you also have First Nations government. And their laws, like I've said, they need to be respected, honored, and implemented. And I would, instead of wasting all the tax dollars fighting this bill, is to start working with chiefs and leadership to implement this bill. It's really in the best interest of the children. There's too many children in foster care under provincial systems. And we've said it this way, that you've got to focus on the children, keep them at home in their communities and their families. And again, that's what I would encourage, because it's one thing to have a bill. It's the next thing is for the implementation of it. And really, that's what this is about, is the implementation of Bill C-92, distinctions-based approach. Everything across Canada right now is delegated authority under the existing Indian Child and Family Services organizations that are there. It's delegated authority from provincial pieces of legislation, which is not really right. And now here's an opportunity for First Nations to exercise their inherent right to self-government, self-determination, create their laws, their own First Nations Child and Family Services Act to improve the quality of life for children. That's what I would encourage in the Belle Province de Québec.
Merci. Prochaine question.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, the next question is from Maria Rodson, the Canadian Press, la presse canadienne. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
My first question is either for Chief Hart or Chief Bellegarde. There's been other times where provincial governments in particular have attempted to do this. I think, Chief Bellegarde, you just mentioned it about delegated authority, which Manitoba did many years ago and just did not seem to work. We have not seen a reduction in the number of kids who are taken into care. Why is this going to be different from that?
It's different because the inherent right is going to be exercised, and who knows better than the communities themselves how to look after their children. And right now the existing system, we all can admit very clearly, it's not working. And so this is an alternative to that. And the existing system, again, is based on somebody else's law. And it's all about making a better quality of life for children that are in that provincial system. There's over 40,000 across Canada. And we know it's not acceptable. We know that's not right. And so this is clearly an alternative to that. But it's under First Nations law and jurisdictions where you can start focusing on prevention, making sure that the children are kept with their family in a loving, caring, nurturing home. That's what this is all about. So it should make a difference in time, no question.
I guess my second question is either for maybe Chief Bellegarde again or Minister Miller. Funding has always been the key issue in terms of actual prevention, which you've both mentioned a few times now. I heard you mention funding, Minister Miller, but what kind of sort of assurances can you give that there will be the funding that is needed to actually implement this? And how long and what kind of funding will it take to actually start to see a reduction in the number of kids that are in foster care in this country?
Do you want to go first and I'll go after?
Well, this is a question I think that is occupying some of the top experts in this country, their time. In particular, what does it take? And it is an issue fundamentally of resources, fundamentally one of how money is allocated to ensure that children are treated at frankly the same standard, better than non-Indigenous children. We have made budgetary requests. The Prime Minister has committed to amounts sufficient to allow communities to transition to affirm the authority over the children that have been taken into care. Even before the law came into force, our department, Indigenous Services Canada, was allocating funds to enter into these agreements. For everyone's benefit, in order to perfect these rights, there are mechanisms by which we will enter into a process so as not to leave children behind, whereby community laws, nation laws will be submitted and discussed with respect to a number of issues, the laws themselves, but also the resources to be allocated. And have to do this as a budgetary process, as an allocation process, but it can't be a top-down process that comes only from Ottawa. This is why the engagement session, notably with AFN, but the rights holders themselves are so important. So we need to increase resources so that we can engage and have those discussions with the rights holders, communities that want to affirm their sovereign laws, and allocate resources accordingly so children aren't taken out of communities and have this resources within the community. So to say that the number is unknown, and this is part of the discussion that I mentioned earlier in a response, is that we have the habit sometimes of throwing numbers at each other. This is a very important protocol by which we will have a roadmap in order to have those discussions and to talk about specific resources, knowing that more will be required and other topics will need to be engaged, principally in and around infrastructure, in and around housing, but also reorienting resources that we have from the intervention model and apprehension model to more of an accompaniment model that gives resources into community to focus on prevention.
It's needs-based. That's the key thing. It's needs-based, and that's once the needs have been identified, then clearly the necessary resources to meet the needs have to flow. And then it's our job to push the crown that happens. Because that's always the biggest thing out on the First Nations territories, out in the communities, that it's good to have the law set up, but you need resources to implement those laws. And that's what it's all about. And if it's needs-based, it's needs-based. And the needs have been identified, the necessary resources should be there to fully implement the First Nations law under their jurisdiction. En français?
En français. C'était une question à propos. C'était une question à propos.
This was a question regarding the resources, the financial and other resources needed to meet the needs of the Indigenous peoples. And before this bill came into force, we had allocated the resources to start these discussions so that Indigenous peoples could assert their rights over their children and their families. These are difficult discussions, both in terms of the legislation and in terms of the resources. Discussions are taking place through the framework we're announcing today with the protocol, with the AFN as well, but also with rights holders, the communities and the families. so that we can transform the intervention model so that it turns into a more preventive and collaborative approach. So there are discussions that will take place. In some cases, communities are ready, others are less ready. So in some cases, there will be some discussions that may take some time, but the resources are being allocated. We'd have to go through all of the communities and all the numbers. We're not talking about any numbers that we could reasonably break down here, perhaps even a few months from now. But we want to support and to make sure the resources are there for communities that want to assert that right. As the National Chief very clearly stated, it's needs-based, and it's through protocols such as this one. This won't be the only one. There could perhaps be others that will be signed with more regional groups, and these will be discussions that will be more detailed than the ones we've had in the past. That is just throwing numbers around or just deciding things in Ottawa without consulting anybody. We're not using that model anymore. We're going forward with a more cooperative approach where the communities can affirm their rights, and we're making sure the resources are there. Thank you. Operator, next question.
Merci. La prochaine question, the next question is from Dylan Robertson, Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Hi there. Thanks for taking the questions today. I have a question for both the Minister and the National Chief. I'm wondering, what is the farthest any groups have gotten into the devolution process under C-92, and what is the main impediment to them achieving this?
Well, Dylan, there have, as you may be aware, there have been a number of communities that have submitted interest in affirming their rights to our. It's not something we discuss publicly. This is really an engagement that is with Indigenous Services Canada and the community in question. So I think part of continuing to build the trust, which is often very tenuous, is to ensure that discussions, even those that are in good faith, and even if I'm saying good things in the public media, are not done without their consent. So I would hesitate to speak I would hesitate generally to speak for those communities, but I was specifically on this issue, which is a very impediments are the ones that have been identified. Generally, resources, obviously COVID, with communities closing down and shutting down and focusing on protecting their community members, elders in particular, has inevitably slowed down discussions. I don't think it's changed anyone's resolve. I think one of the lessons from coming out of COVID is it will strengthen the resolve in the areas that were priorities to Indigenous peoples, and foremost of which is control, custody, and the affirmation over an inherent right to their children. But that is very much, I believe, and hopefully a temporary measure. There will be discussions over a number of issues, not only the substance of the laws that are put forward, but also the resources and allocation. It really depends on capacity within the community, numbers of children, data. There are a number of issues that were identified in committee as the law was being discussed and adopted that remain, Dylan. And so I would point you to those in particular, but I won't go into any detail of what any particular community or nation has asked us out of respect for that nation. Thank you.
I can just add, Dylan, one of the biggest challenges going forward, there should almost be like 13 bilats in addition to what's going on with C-92 across Canada, because you have to engage the provinces. And some provincial premiers and governments are a little bit more advantageous or more open to deal with this and have better relationships with First Nations chiefs and leaders in their respective territories than others. Let's be open and frank about it. And so one of the biggest challenges is to working with premiers and the appropriate ministers and chiefs and their leadership to talk about transition, to talk about existing laws, to make sure that children don't fall through the cracks, because this is all about embracing change, because we both know the status quo is not acceptable. So that's one of the biggest challenges, is getting the premiers and the territorial governments to accept that there is a jurisdiction that needs to be respected, and let's set up those tables together, province by province, territory by territory, with First Nations leadership to work this out. And that's the most important thing going forward. And I think if all levels of government focus on the children, this can get done. So it's really embracing that change is afoot, and it should really be embraced because it really is about bringing down those numbers in a system that doesn't work. 40,000 is way too high, and it's just not acceptable.
As follow-up, Dylan?
And National Chief, which provinces are the ones that are getting in the way here?
Well, I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, Dylan, but we've just talked about, one province constitutionally challenging the constitutionality of C-92, so that should speak for itself. There are some other premiers that are willing to work with First Nations chiefs and have done some positive things, but there's still a long way to go. So I would just encourage that the bilats be set up as soon as possible to respect First Nations jurisdiction and start getting to work on the implementation of this, because it's high time. Like I said earlier on, it's one thing to have a law, but it's really more important for the implementation of it to really bring about change that's so desperately needed to meet the needs of the children across Canada.
Thank you. Operator, next question. Prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, the next question is from Todd Lamirande, APTN National News. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Thank you. Good morning, Minister Miller and National Chief Bellegarde. I'm just wondering, how will the COVID crisis and the projected deficit because of it, and I heard the number $250 billion thrown around, affect these bilateral meetings when you're going to be talking Turkey and talking about funding? And, to protect against future austerity measures, and I don't have to remind the National Chief that it was a Liberal government that put in a 2% annual funding cap well over a decade ago.
And I would say to anyone listening, Todd, what is the cost of doing nothing? We've seen what the cost of inaction is. We see it in court cases. We see it in the socioeconomic gaps that are the unacceptable disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and particularly the most vulnerable, including children and the elderly. When you talk about a large number of a deficit, I think we need to look at ourselves as Canadians and say, where do we invest? What are our most precious assets? Who are we as a country? Who are we in terms of who we represent, or at least pretend to be? Are we living up to that standard? All those questions, in my mind, you always have to be prudent fiscally, and this isn't a question. And in this case, being wise fiscally is investing in the most important asset, which is children, and the resources that are the largest growing segment of the population. We've tried the other model, and it costs money, and it would. If you look at it from a numbers perspective, the courts are telling us what to do, and we've been spending time as a federal government catching up to court cases. And so we want to get ahead of this. Part of fixing is recognizing the errors of the past and also making the investments. So that's why the importance of money, and you highlighted it, Todd, but there is also a reflective part of this, which is one where we ask people to think about what the cost is of inaction. And we've seen it, and you can price it increasingly, and it is much larger than, frankly, the cost of investing into what is the most one of the most precious, if not the most precious asset, if you can even term it in those words of this country, which is in children.
Just to add to Minister Miller's comments, Todd, is that, I've always talked about the gap in Canada, the socioeconomic gap that exists between First Nations people and the rest of Canadians. I used to use the number 6 versus 63rd. Depending on the latest statistics, it could be 7 versus 73. But Canada, according to the United Nations Human Development Index, is rated very high, 6th quality of life. But when you apply the same indices to First Nations people, we're 63rd. It needs to be closed. And so that's why you see historically that the $21.4 billion over 7 fiscal years to catch up in housing and education and water and infrastructure and healthcare. the social determinants of good health, like because First Nations people weren't even at the same starting line, and so that has to continue. Then bring it back more into focus related to the 40,000 children in care, and the fastest growing segment of the population in Canada are young First Nations men and women. And so you need to invest in that human capital, that pool, to make sure that there's good education opportunities, good healthcare, proper healthcare, so these people, our young people, can really contribute to the overall growth of Canada. So once that gap closes and you invest in children because they're gifts from the Creator, that's what our elders always tell us. Children are gifts from the Creator. You got to focus on them, and they'll have huge returns on investment for the country overall because the gap will close. And we say when you invest in those social determinants of health, it's not only good for First Nations people, it's good for the country as a whole. And that's really what it's all about. So we have to continue with those investments, and that's what I call them, investments. And even in spite of COVID-19, these are things of getting basic fundamental human rights and getting First Nations people to the starting line as the rest of Canadian society.
As a follow-up, Todd?
National Chief, you talked about perhaps having 13 bilateral meetings, meaning all the provinces and territories have to come aboard, and there was talk about Quebec instituting a constitutional challenge. But what about a province like Saskatchewan? There are a lot of First Nations or Indigenous children in care in that province. Mm-hmm. And ever since Bill C-92 was passed and implemented in January, they've expressed some reservations over it. Would it come down to maybe the federal government having to sue a province to get them to cede control?
I don't know. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the federal government, Todd, but I would just encourage again the premiers in Saskatchewan. I'm from Saskatchewan, and I know Premier Scott Moe is there, Chief Bobby Cameron is there, Vice Chief David Pratt's in charge of the portfolio. You've got tribal councils. There's some really exciting things with Tribal Chief Mark Arcan, the Saskatoon Tribal Council. So it varies province by province by province in terms of where people are at with the implementation of C-92. I would just encourage again the provincial premiers and the governments to embrace change and to set up those bilats and to start working with First Nations leaders. It's more productive when you sit down and start cooperating and collaborating, communicating together for the implementation of C-92, because ultimately you're going to get better results. And that's really what it's all about. And that's what I'm going to keep encouraging. And it's different every province by province and territory by territory in terms of what kind of relationship they have with their premiers and their respective provincial governments or territorial governments. And so, but I encourage that to happen, those bilats to happen, because that's part of the implementation. It's collaboration, communication, and talking and working together to bring about change. Because I'm going to keep harping on it. 40,000 children in foster care, not acceptable. So let's focus on prevention. Let's respect First Nations jurisdiction over children, because First Nations law is paramount. And let's move.
Thank you, merci. We will now take questions from the room. Again, one question, one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions dans la salle. Encore une fois, une question et une question suivie.
Minister's National Chief and Elder Mitchell, Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. Indigenous youth in care and many advocates say that since your government pledged to overhaul the Indigenous child welfare system, they have seen little to no change. And now they're watching your federal government spend billions of dollars on COVID-19 relief. And what they're saying is that this just goes to show your government has always had the means to address the inequalities in the child welfare system, but it has chosen not to. So, Minister Miller, can you be very clear this morning as to how much money the federal government is willing to commit to overhaul the First Nations portion of the child welfare system, what the timeline is, and if you can't give these numbers, why is that?
Well, thank you, Olivia, and I read your article. So I guess you're quoting Dr. Blackstock, and I don't think I won't criticize her words. She is someone who spends every waking hour fighting for Indigenous children, and I deeply respect that. The fact that there is that criticism out there is something we need to think about. The COVID money, I won't call it a false equivalency because it has been focused on ensuring that Canadians, Indigenous peoples living in Canada, stay safe and have the resources available to fight a pandemic, the viral profile of which we have still fully yet to understand, and that we are still very much worried about. And so ensuring that no one gets left behind has been a seamless thread of what this government has tried to do from the outset, and resource to that end has been has been its sole resolve, but there has been a number of other issues that have created a unique vulnerability in Indigenous communities, notably the socioeconomic gaps as embodied in overcrowding and susceptibility to the disease that we have been at pains to work with communities to deploy resources into. With respect to children in care, for example, as a specific example, we moved quite promptly to ensure that children that were aging out of care were financially supported and were able to continue because of that unique vulnerability that I highlighted earlier. I have made and will continue to make budgetary asks. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance will continue to support the implementation of C92. As I mentioned in a previous answer, I think COVID has made us realize the importance, perhaps even of accelerating a number of the challenges that we see in Indigenous communities. But it takes that collaboration and work with Indigenous communities, and in this case, also provincial and territorial partners, to sit down at the table and start numbering things out. We have thrown numbers around, but they are far from precise and far from accurate of specific needs on the ground. So the reason an aggregate number doesn't reflect particular needs is because there are so many. They need to be broken out, and they need to be done with the rights holders, which are community members and nations, as we engage into the process of affirming that right, inherent right, over child and family services.
If this is needs-based allocation and more than half of the kids in care are Indigenous, is this conversation really about pulling up to half of provincial child welfare budgets and putting it into new Indigenous child welfare services?
Well, we're going to have to sit down, and one of the conversations that we are going to have to sit down at tripartite tables with provinces is to talk about resources and how they're allocated, not only the quantum, but also to what end they are allocated, from going from an intervention model to a prevention model. And that will require a rethinking of a way of doing things that we've been doing up to now and that has failed. So that will inevitably require discussions with the provinces. There have been a lot of talk about conflict with the provinces, and we have some deep objections to some of the legal challenges. But I'd prefer to be in a discussion as to who is doing the best job by Indigenous children, and not who has the right to continue to be doing a miserable job, which is what we've been doing up to now. That means what the National Chief ended his statement on in a previous answer, which is collaboration. We talked a lot about Quebec, but I've had some great discussions with Ministre d'Amour about how their system needs to do better. And we will continue that, and the federal government will be there every step of the way. But we have the tendency too often to embody these in sort of court cases and flashpoints of conflict. But this will require some sitting down, some difficult conversations with Indigenous partners at the table, and not simply among federal and provincial officials. J'essaie de me souvenir ce que
In French, please. Answer, Minister Miller. I'll try to remember what I said, and I'm sorry if I forget some bits. I'll start with how I just concluded. We have this bad habit of talking about who's doing the worst job possible instead of talking about who's doing the best job with Indigenous peoples, specifically the children. So this framework of analysis will focus on cooperation, dialogue, discussion with Indigenous partners and provinces on resources, on how we do things. And we can see that the way things have been done so far has not worked. Everybody knows we need to do better. But too often, the emphasis is on the optics of a constitutional conflict, while my discussions with ministers from Quebec have been productive ones. We focus on cooperation, the importance of reforming the system, of asserting this right, the Indigenous people's rights, that is the control over their laws, over their people, how they want to work with their children. I mean, that goes without saying, but it takes a commitment to financial resources dialogue, and we need to look at how on prevention and the development of communities, which has not really been done so far.
There's Molly Thomas, CTV National News. Minister Miller, let me come back to you and double down on my colleague's question. Is there a timeline on those budgetary asks and for these regional meetings to happen? Because this bill was given royal assent last June. It's a whole nother year that children are in a system that you say doesn't work.
So these discussions are important to framing the engagement that we have in terms of resource, in terms of engagement. I don't think you would hear from the national chief that he would be speaking in the name of different communities. There are protocols that we need to engage when a community is prepared to affirm its inherent right over its children to come into a process so that no children get left behind. Now that will vary from community to community. It's not something that will happen overnight or at a set time point. This will take many years. It's no surprise to anyone that there are different capacities without judging within communities. Some communities are ready, some are less ready. These will be discussions that have sometimes nothing to do in most people's mind with prevention and intervention, but sometimes over housing capacity and challenges in some of the communities that may have, frankly, more children in care. I want to clarify one point that I'm sure you weren't intending to misconstrue, but on January 1st, it was an important date because it set that national standard for the rights of the child. And even before that, courts were looking towards that standard. So courts have to apply that. But when you get to a court case, more often than not, the intervention has occurred. And so what we're doing is turning people's minds to the issue of this unacceptable issue throughout Canada, moving provinces, moving territories towards prevention models and ensuring that an inherent right is respected. And so these are longer processes and longer discussions that will involve bilateral and trilateral meetings with a vast number of communities over a number of years.
Budgetary ask.
So in terms of budgetary ask, I've put and we've worked quite clearly to get numbers out for what we profile to be uptake, I guess, over the next fiscal year or so, assuming a 5-year model. Now we might not be right, but these are discussions, and I think this is one of the utilities of the protocols today is fixing what those numbers may be on an aggregate level, knowing that we might not get it right, but knowing that because it is a needs-based model that we must always come back for more. There is a machinery of government aspect to this I think you're alluding to, and so I think in the next little while we can expect numbers to roll out. Those are not numbers that I'm at liberty to disclose, but I would note that even before the coming into force of the law, we were allocating resources to communities that wanted to engage and giving them financial resources to engage and start that process.
Chief Bellegarde, my second question is for you. I want to ask about Quebec and them being against C-92. We're having a needed but uncomfortable conversation about race, about dignity and autonomy in our country right now. Do you see Quebec's rejection of this act as systemic racism against your people?
Discrimination against First Nations people because they rejected C-92. Everybody's trying to protect their quote jurisdiction. That's mind all governments, everyone in this room and across Canada, that there is the original governments of this land, First Nations governments, and that there is another law that needs to be respected. Creator's law, natural law, First Nations law, in addition to common law and civil law. And that's the road. If we start talking about restorative justice or reconciliation in Canada, on the bigger piece, that's where we need to go. And I think there's an education awareness process right across Canada that's required so that people don't forget that. And that's all that we're trying to work out here now, is that in C-92, First Nations law is paramount. It's clear. And that's the first time that other governments have recognized that First Nations law is paramount, above federal law, provincial law, when it's developed. But now it's implementation time. And so I would just encourage people to continue to collaborate, communicate, and work together, and to respect and recognize that there is another jurisdiction in Canada. And that's really what it's all about. If you want to start talking about reconciliation and jurisdiction and respect, to not forget, in 1867, the British North America Act, it wasn't just the federal government, provincial governments, and territorial governments. There's also First Nations governments, and that's what we need to keep in mind going forward. And that's my response.
Merci. Prochaine question.
Bonjour.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, I'm from Radio-Canada. Good morning. The chief of the First Nations in Quebec, Mr. Picard, stated that it was dishonest. The attitude was dishonest. Do you share this?
Said that Quebec's attitude towards all of this was dishonest. Do you share that assessment? And if not, what is your assessment? En français et en anglais.
Écoutez,
Answer. Minister Miller. Listen, from the beginning, well, I can tell you about my personal experiences with Minister D'Amour in terms of this specific issue, and we've worked collaboratively and cooperatively. We have a disagreement in terms of the constitutionality of this law. I won't hide that. As I stated in English, I want to have this discussion that is who's doing the best job, not who's doing the worst job over generations. We want to affirm the rights and their monetary consequences. But the reality is that there's a lot of cooperation happening, and there will need to be more. It's the provinces that are largely in charge of the child welfare system. Nobody will deny this right to children. One of the big good points of this legislation is that it puts the focus on things that we are not used to talking about and putting it forward. That's one thing that we've gotten right. But the implementation is what remains. It will take years. It will be difficult. And there was also the affirmation of inherent rights that were denied the Indigenous peoples for generations. Chief Picard is somebody I respect deeply. He's very passionate about this because we're talking about the children of his people. So I don't want to criticize what he stated at all. I respect what he said, but I can tell you that we have worked together and that we will need to continue working together cooperatively to ensure that this inherent right is respected.
It just demonstrates the frustration. Chief Picard sits on our AFN executive representing Quebec and the First Nations in Quebec and the nations there. And it shows, his comments shows that the level of frustration is not getting it. It's not recognized the First Nations law and jurisdiction in that province. And so you see that sense of frustration. And that's why statements are made like that. And of course you have to support, because that's the lived experience, and you can't deny that. And so again, to encourage those bilats to be developed and implemented in that province, to sit down with them and to respect the jurisdiction of the Cree and of the Wendat and the Mohawk, the Ongwahoe, the Haudenosaunee peoples that are there, and the Innu, like they're nation, the Abenaki, like there's many nations in La Belle Province de Quebec. And their jurisdiction needs to be respected. And when you have strong comments like that, it shows you the level of frustration, and that you can't deny that. It's real and it's a lived experience. So we need to turn that and try to get into an energy where people do get something positive together. That's how I see.
See, and in English to you and en français to Mr. Miller as well. Children and communities have been waiting a long time for this. There is constitutional challenges in court that might take years. What is your deadline? Quel est votre deadline, Monsieur Miller, pour que ce soit en place?
Question: what's your deadline, Mr. Miller, for implementing this?
It was the The deadline is as soon as possible, like to encourage, again, not to waste energy and effort and time challenging the constitutionality of C-92 and start working with First Nations leadership to implement it in a respectful way, focusing on the children. It's focusing on the children in care, because this is really what it's all about. And any level of government cannot argue with that, putting the needs of the children first. And by looking at a constitutional challenge, it wastes time, energy, and effort. It's a waste, you know. It's just as soon as possible to sit down. So that would be
J'ai peut-être mal compris la question, mais
Answer. Perhaps I didn't perhaps I didn't understand the question properly, but the law is in effect. We didn't suspend it. Yeah, if there are First Nations who want to affirm the rights in the province of Quebec, we support that. We're continuing with our work. Money has nothing to do with the Constitution. I mean, nothing was suspended. The Act has come into force. The protocol agreement, this one, applies to the AFN. So they're going to move forward, whether it's with Quebec or not. And we will do what we do based on the protocol itself. So we're continuing our work. And in terms of the legal challenge, we will defend our constitutional rights as we have done in the past. Thank you. This puts an end. This ends the press conference. Thank you.